Welcome back. In this video, we will talk about for loop, which is conceptually, you can think of it as count control loops or definite loops. And these kinds of loops are ideal for situations when you just want to loop through a set of items. I use the term set or collection here very loosely. In a future class, we'll talk about advanced data structures. Set has a different connotation. We'll talk about things like lists. They all have different connotations. But for this class, I'm just talking about this very loosely. I'm just saying that this kind of a loop, the for loop, is great for situations when you have a bunch of things in a collection, or think of them as a bunch of things in a bucket, and you just want to loop through those items. Okay? So this is where the definite component comes in. There's a number of items, and you want to loop through or repeat as many times as there are items in that bucket. Pretty soon we're going to be looking at specific examples that should hopefully tell you when you would use for loop, and also importantly, you can also appreciate the difference between for loop and the while loops. Okay? And again, technically I would call as an iterable object, which is basically again a fancy term for collection of things or set of things. Okay? This could be things like a list of items, or shortly we'll be using a range function to generate a list of numbers. Okay, this is just a technical term I use to refer to this idea of list of items, list of numbers, or a set of items. And another term that I want to introduce to you is that typically the for loop, again, here's the syntax for the for loop. Just like a while loop, you have the first line that basically says for, and then a variable name in a bunch of things, a bunch of values in a list, right? So this num could be x, y, z, whatever it is a variable, and this variable is known as the target variable. Okay, and so here's a syntax, and this is a variable that's a target variable. And what really happens is that you have a block of code here, a bunch of statements, and this loop, the for loop, is going to run as many times as there are items in this list. And you can see here that there are 4 items. So this block of statements will run 4 times. Okay. And something that's interesting about for loop is that every time this loop runs, this variable, this target variable, right, num, will be assigned to this value. So first time the loop runs, num will be value 1. Second time the loop runs, num will take on the value 2, and so on. Again, pretty soon you're going to see a practical example, a concrete example, so you can actually see how the for loop works. Okay, and in my opinion, it's a much easier loop to understand, especially when compared to the while loop. Okay, so you saw the syntax here, and again, conceptually, this is how it works. So you have the beginning, you have a bunch of things, bunch of statements you have here, and then here's your for loop. You start the, write the first item. You basically say for num in a bunch of items. And then this block of code will execute as many times as there are items in the list. So in this example, right, there are 4 items. So this loop will run 4 times. And then it will exit the loop and will continue, working through the rest of the statements. So hopefully, conceptually, you kind of get what I'm trying to say. And we're going to look at specific examples, right, next. And it's going to be very clear what for loop does. And it's actually pretty simple. So here's the example, right? I basically am taking this for loop, right? And the block of code has only one statement, one programming statement. And what you see happen here is that here is the list of things, right? And again, by the way, technically this is a list. Again, we haven't covered lists yet. So for the time being, just think of them as a bunch of things that you have, right? For the for loop to run through. And here you see that there are 5 values, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so this loop will run as many times as there are items in the list. And you see 5 items here. Okay. So it's going to run 5 times. Okay. And num is the target variable because it's a variable name. Again, this doesn't have to be num. If you want, you can call it x, y, z, whatever you want to call it. I just choose to call it num for the time being. Okay. And this is the target variable. And so this loop is going to run 5 times. You already know this because I can see the number of items in this list. And the interesting thing, as I mentioned before, is that each time this loop runs, it will take, the target variable will take on the value of each of these items. Okay. And so it's basically going to be first time as 1, second time as 2, third time as 3, and so on. Okay. And then it exits out of the loop, and I can see that because of the indentation here, right? And then I have 2 print statements purely for aesthetic and pedagogical purposes. It's basically indicating that I exited out of the loop and I'm printing these 2 statements. Okay. So let me run this code and see what's getting printed. And as we expected, this is basically running, this loop runs 5 times. Each time it runs, the value taken by num, the target variable, is basically the actual items themselves. And so when I print the target variable num, it's going to print those items, right? And then it exits out of the loop, and then it has these 2 print statements. So it's a very simple repetition structure, easy to understand, especially when compared to the while loop. Okay. And here's another example, right? Now think about it. What is the target variable in this for statement? Right? We talked about this idea of target variable. So here, the previous statement, it's num. And in this example, it's name. Name is the target variable. It's a variable. It's a target variable in the for loop. And think about how many times you think this loop is going to run. And so to answer the question, you need to ask yourself how many items or things are there in this collection or list. Okay. So here you have 3 items. Okay. And so it basically is going to run, the loop is going to run 3 times. And each time the loop runs, the value of the target variable will change. Okay. So I'm going to run the code now, but try to visualize what is going to get printed when I run this code. Okay. So let's go. So you can see again, as expected, the loop ran 3 times. And as you can see clearly, each time the loop ran, the target variable took on the value of the items that are here. Okay. So now what I would like to do is spend a few minutes talking about the range function. It's just another way for me to generate this list of things, right? Specifically generate a list of numbers. And the syntax for range looks something like this. It can actually take these 3 parameters: a start value, an end value, and the increment value. Okay. And again, to help you understand how the range function works, I've given you a link here. So if I run this code, you can actually see the link here. It's basically telling you how the range function works. Okay. It has a lot of good specific information. So again, I'm going to advise you to take a look at this on your own time and make sure that you understand, right, what's going to happen when you use a range function with numbers like these. Okay. As I mentioned, it can take up to 3 parameters. And when there are 3 parameters, it's fairly straightforward. This is a start value, this is the end value, and this is the increment. Okay. And the tricky part here for range function is that the start, especially when it's not specified, okay, you can assume that it's going to start from 0. Okay. And this 5 is the end value. But for range functions, it's basically up to, but not including the end value. So you basically go and stop just before 5. So in this case, you're going to start at 0 and you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And you're not going to include 5 because it's up to, but not including 5. Okay, that's what this end value signifies. Okay, and that's what I try to tell you here. End, where you want to end the range, but that number is excluded. Okay, so when I have range 5, it's basically going to start at 0, by default value 0, all the way up to, but not including 5. Again, default increment is 1. It's going to increment by 1. Okay, and you see 2 values like this. So it's basically going to be, instead of the default of 0 start point, you're going to start at 3. The end is still the same, up to, but not including 9, right? And if you don't see a third parameter, which is the increment, by default, it's going to increment by 1. Just change the value and increase the value by 1. So it's going to start at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it stops at 8 because it's up to, but not including 9. Okay. But when you have an increment function, increment value that's not 1, it's 3 in this example. So again, similar idea. I started to, up to, but not including 20, not including 20 in increments of 3. So I start at 2, and then I add 3 to it, so that's 5, add another 3, 8, 11, 14, 17. If I add another 3, it's actually 20, but I don't want to include 20 because it's up to but not including 20. Okay? At the very least, when you look at these range functions with these values for parameters, you need to know what numbers you think it's going to generate. That's very important. Okay? So again, review this web page. Okay, now that we've reviewed the for loop and we've looked at the range function, what I would like us to do is start writing simple programs. So before we even look at this first exercise, let's take a look at the code that I have here for you. Okay, take a look at the code and think about what you think will be printing out when you run this code. Okay, it's a for loop, one line of code in the repetition block, right? Just printing the target variable value. How many times do you think this loop will run, and what is going to print as the loop runs, right? Again, when you specify one parameter like range 5, so let's see if this works. Okay, so yeah, so as expected, we basically ended up printing 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, the next thing I would like you to do is basically think about what do you need to do, right? So instead of printing 0 to 4, let's say that I want to print 1 to 5. I don't want the value 0 to be printed. I just want a loop to run 5 times, and I want to print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Very similar to the problem we solved for the while loop. Print the first 5 positive integers. So what change you think we need to make that work? Okay, so pause the video, take a moment to think about it. See if we can run the code to generate 1 through 5. Okay, the first 5 positive integers. All right. Okay, so hopefully I have two different solutions possible for this. There are multiple ways of doing this, obviously, and you can of course also use a while loop, and we did this in the previous module, right? But here is one way I can use a for loop to do to generate the first 5 positive integers. I basically say, instead of just saying range 5, I can use 2 parameters, and I can explicitly specify the starting value as 1. And if I do that, right, remember that I want to start at 1, but I want to finish at 5, not 4. So the ending point would be not 5, but 6. Okay, so again, I note that I'm generalizing the value of 5, but I'm just assigning the value 5 to n. This way I can basically say, instead of first n, if n is 5, this will be 6. So it's to be 1, 6. If n is 10, it's going to be 1 and 11. Okay, so I'm just kind of generalizing the problem. Instead of first 5 positive integers, I'm writing the code for first n positive integers. Okay, and the change I made is basically explicitly specify the starting value, and then instead of n or 5, it's going to be plus 1, 5 plus 1, or n plus 1. Okay, let's see if this code works. I'm going to run the code, and you can see that it ran 5 times, started at 1, up to but not including 6, and so this printed all the way up to 5. Okay, here's a second way of doing the exact same thing, where let's say n is 5. This is the problem we started with, right? Again, I'm kind of generalizing this for any n. If there's 5 here, right, and I said I wanted, instead of 0, I wanted 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So all I need to do is I need to print, instead of the target variable, which is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, I just print target variable plus 1, right? Second way of solving the problem, and bingo, so I got the answer. Okay, this is the problem for which you can use either the while loop or the for loop, but it's in your interest to try to use the for loop because it's so much simpler, less opportunities for making an error. And if I scroll all the way back here to the while loop, right, you can see that you have to do specific things, right? I have to set up an initial variable, and then I have to set up the condition, and then I have to make sure that the condition eventually becomes, from true to false so that it can exit the loop. right? So yes, you can solve the problem using the while loop, but I would argue that it's better off, you are better off if you actually use the for loop to solve this specific problem. I also want to point you to another example, right? This is what we tackled, very first example that we tackled for the while loop, right? Here, the way we set up the problem is not how many consumers. It's basically after running each loop, we are asking the end user, do you want to continue? Yes or no? So you do not know ahead of time how many consumers are there for you to process, right? So this is a problem, I would argue, you cannot use a for loop because you do not know ahead of time how many consumers are there, right? So in this example, I have to use a while loop, okay? And so again, coming back to the for loop, my advice is if you think you can use a for loop to solve a problem, please do so, okay? It's much easier to set up and solve, okay? And so here I'm just reviewing again how the range function should look like, okay? And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm giving you a bunch of values here, right? Range functions with specific values. I would like you to run the code, but before you run the code, think about what you think is going to be printing out. Okay, so here's 1, starting value 1, ending value 6, which is up to but not including 6, and in increments of 2. So think about when you run this code, what you think is going to print, right? And then run the code, and hopefully your visualization of what you think would happen matches with what's happening. Okay, so please do that for all of these code cells here. Understand what's happening. Okay, and especially I have some interesting cases here. What happens when I increment by -1 instead of +1, right? So again, the link I posted before, tackle some of these issues, review them, and then come back here, run the code, and make sure that you understand what happens when you use the range function to generate a list of numbers. Okay, and then what I would also like you to do is just kind of go back to the while loop and think about some of these problems and see if you can solve them with the for loop. For example, some of the first n numbers, you should be able to use a for loop to solve this problem. Specifically, I'm going to say first n positive integers. I'm going to make it more clear. All right, and I have other problems here. Think about rewriting credit approval example using a for loop. So I want you to think about it and write code using a for loop after figuring out what information you would need, right? And again, it's going to help you think about when to use for loops and when to use while loops. All right, and then I have some other problems here, fairly simple, right? So please make sure that you solve them using for loops. And then I want to go back up here. I had a simple problem. I'm going to actually copy and paste it at the very end before I upload this Jupyter Notebook. Also try to see if we can print the first 5 positive even numbers, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Okay, so see if you can do that. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here so that you have all of these problems in the same place. Try to see if you can solve these problems using the for loop. Okay, thank you.